Ancient DNA is a powerful new tool. It is a new kind of historical proof. It comes from the bones. It comes from the teeth. It comes from the buried hair of our ancestors. Scientists can now read tiny, fragile fragments of this genetic material. This process gives us a fresh and stunningly intimate view of our human past. It helps us understand with new clarity where people came from. It shows us how they moved across the vast landscapes of the world. It reveals how they met. It reveals how they mixed. It reveals how they created new communities long, long ago. This science is not just about data. It is about recovering lost stories. It is about giving voice to the silent. It is about painting a more complete and truthful portrait of the human family. So, what exactly is this remarkable substance we call ancient DNA? It is the genetic code, the blueprint of life, recovered from the remains of organisms that lived in the distant past. This code, made of a molecule called deoxyribonucleic acid, can sometimes survive for thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years. It can be preserved within the hard, protective casing of bones' teeth. Scientists have developed extraordinarily careful methods to find and extract these precious fragments. They work in ultra-clean laboratories, often wearing full-body protective suits, to avoid contaminating the ancient samples with their own modern DNA. It is a meticulous, painstaking process, like searching for a single specific grain of sand on a vast beach. The recovery process is only the first step. Once extracted, this ancient DNA is often broken into millions of tiny pieces. The challenge then becomes reassembling this genetic puzzle. Thanks to powerful new technologies, often called next-generation sequencing, scientists can read these millions of short fragments simultaneously. Sophisticated computer programs then help them piece the code back together, comparing it to reference maps of the human genome. This allows them to reconstruct large portions of an ancient individual's genetic makeup. It is a triumph of modern science that we can now read the biological instructions of a person who walked the earth when the pyramids were being built, or even long before. Why is this so revolutionary? For a very long time, historians and archaeologists had to infer human connections from material culture. If two distant communities used similar styles of pottery, it might suggest a connection, perhaps through trade or migration. But this was always an interpretation, a best guess. Ancient DNA provides a direct biological link. It doesn't just suggest a connection, it can prove it. For far too long, the history of Africa was written with a damaging and fundamentally incorrect assumption. It was often portrayed as a continent without history, a place that was static and unchanging until the arrival of Europeans. This Eurocentric view presented African societies as simple, isolated, and primitive, a narrative that served to justify colonial exploitation. Ancient DNA is a powerful tool for dismantling this myth. It provides undeniable, scientific proof of the exact opposite. A continent that has always been a place of immense complexity, constant movement, sophisticated societies. The genetic data reveals a history as dynamic and interconnected as any other in the world, and in many cases, far more so. The evidence is written directly in the genes of ancient peoples. For example, genetic studies of remains from across the continent are uncovering vast networks of connection that existed thousands of years ago. DNA from individuals buried in one region often shows ancestry from hundreds of miles away, or even thousands of miles away. This shatters the image of small, isolated tribes. Instead, it paints a picture of a continent crisscrossed by ancient pathways of interaction. People were not locked into one place. They were moving, trading, marrying, exchanging ideas across ecological and cultural boundaries, creating a rich and layered human landscape long before the first European ships appeared on the horizon. Consider the notion of great African kingdoms and empires. Great Zimbabwe, Mali, Aksum. Ancient DNA adds a new dimension to their stories. It can show the genetic makeup of the people who built and lived in these centers of power, reveal the diverse origins of their populations, and confirm these were vibrant, multicultural societies, melting pots of their time, centers of innovation and culture. This new scientific reality forces us to revise the old, simplistic narratives. The idea of an unchanging Africa can no longer stand against the weight of genetic evidence. The continent was not waiting to be discovered. It was a world of its own, with its own epic histories of migration, empire building, cultural exchange. Ancient DNA does not invent this history, it illuminates it. It provides a new lens through which we can see the deep, complex, and interconnected story of the African past in a more truthful light, free from the distortions of colonial prejudice. It helps us restore the continent and its peoples to their rightful place at the center of the human story. Ancient DNA is dramatically reshaping our understanding of how people moved within Africa. Goods moved within Africa. Ideas moved within Africa, long before the colonial era. It provides a biological map that complements the archaeological record, trade goods, artifacts. By analyzing the genetic makeup of ancient individuals, scientists can identify foreign ancestry, revealing that someone, or their recent ancestors, traveled from a distant region. This evidence brings the ancient world to life, transforming abstract ideas about trade networks into concrete stories of human mobility. It shows us that Africa was not a patchwork of isolated groups, but a great crossroads where people were in constant contact with one another. One of the most powerful examples of this comes from the study of ancient individuals buried along the Swahili coast of East Africa. For centuries, this coast was a major hub in the Indian Ocean trade network connecting Africa to Arabia, Persia, India. Archaeological evidence shows the presence of foreign goods like Chinese porcelain, Persian pottery. Now, ancient DNA from burials in places like Kenya, Tanzania, confirms this story in a deeply personal way. The genetics of individuals who lived there over 1,000 years ago show a mixture of African ancestry, Asian ancestry, direct proof that people were not just trading goods, but were living together, building families, creating a unique and cosmopolitan Swahili culture. This pattern of movement was not limited to the coasts. Ancient DNA is also revealing the extent of interaction across the continent's vast interior. Studies are tracing genetic links between West Africa, the Sahel, showing movement along major rivers like the Niger, and across the formidable Sahara Desert. The spread of genes associated with cattle herding, for instance, can be tracked across thousands of miles, mirroring the spread of pastoralist cultures. This genetic data helps us visualize ancient highways of communication and exchange, where people drove their livestock, carried valuable commodities like salt, gold, and in the process shared their DNA and their cultures with the people they met along the way. These genetic findings give us a more human-centered view of the past. When we find a bead from India in an African archaeological site, it is an interesting data point. But when we find the DNA of a person with South Asian ancestry buried in an ancient African community, the story becomes profoundly different. It is no longer just about the movement of objects, it is about the movement of people. It is about their journeys, their interactions, and the families they formed. Ancient DNA allows us to see the individuals who were the living embodiment of these long-distance connections, reminding us that history is ultimately the story of human lives intertwined. While genetics does not directly encode for technology, it allows us to track the movements of the people who carried new ideas and practices with them. By tracing population movements, we can develop a clearer picture of how key innovations spread across the continent: agriculture, metalworking, transforming societies as they went. The transition from hunting and gathering to farming and herding was one of the most significant changes in human history. Ancient DNA helps us trace this process in Africa with unprecedented detail. For example, genetic studies can show when and where populations of farmers began to expand and mix with local forager groups. We can see the genetic legacy of the Bantu expansion, a massive movement of people speaking Bantu languages that started in West Central Africa thousands of years ago. They carried farming techniques with them, and their DNA can now be found in populations across much of sub-Saharan Africa. Similarly, we can trace the spread of pastoralism: cattle, sheep, goats. Ancient DNA from herders who lived thousands of years ago in places like the Rift Valley in East Africa reveals their connections to peoples from northeastern Africa. This suggests that the knowledge of herding, and perhaps the animals themselves, moved south with migrating people. The DNA also shows how these incoming herders interacted and mixed with local foraging populations, sometimes adopting them into their way of life, and other times living alongside them. This creates a complex genetic mosaic that reflects a dynamic history of cultural and technological exchange. This genetic story of innovation challenges the old, passive view of African history. It shows a continent where people were actively developing new ways to live, new strategies for producing food, new technologies for shaping their world. From the first stone tools to the complex metallurgy of the Iron Age, Africa has always been a crucible of human creativity. Ancient DNA helps us connect the dots, showing how these brilliant innovations were carried across the landscape not as abstract concepts, but by the people themselves. It highlights their agency, their intelligence, and their central role in driving human progress from the very beginning. This is really a powerful way to see continuity and change over time. The history of the transatlantic slave trade is one of the most painful and traumatic chapters in human history. For over 400 years, millions of African men, women, children were forcibly captured, torn from their homes, and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean under brutal conditions. The sheer scale of this crime and the deliberate destruction of records have made it incredibly difficult for many people in the African diaspora to trace their roots. Ancient DNA, along with modern genetic testing, is now providing a new, though painful, tool to help illuminate this dark history and bridge the gaps created by this immense violence. This science can help us understand the geographic origins of enslaved people with greater precision. By comparing the DNA of people of African descent in the Americas to the DNA of diverse populations across Africa, scientists can identify the regions from which their ancestors were most likely taken. This work can confirm and enrich what we know from the scattered shipping records that have survived. For many, seeing a link to a specific region in Africa, Senegambia, the Bight of Benin, West Central Africa, can be a profoundly moving experience. It does not erase the pain of the past, but it can provide a tangible connection to a lost homeland and a starting point for reclaiming a piece of their identity. The genetic data also reveals the horrific scale and specific patterns of the trade. How certain US states have a higher prevalence of ancestry from particular African regions, reflecting the trading routes that supplied those areas. It can also reveal the brutal demographic impact, such as the disproportionate number of women taken from certain regions. This biological evidence serves as a stark, scientific testament to the calculated cruelty of the system. It writes the story of this atrocity into the very genomes of living people, an indelible record of the forced migration that shaped the modern Americas. We must approach this work with the utmost care and sensitivity. This is not just an academic exercise. It is about people's deepest sense of self and the inherited trauma of their ancestors. For some, discovering their roots can be a powerful and healing journey of reconnection. For others, it can be a painful reminder of what was stolen. The science of genetics cannot undo the horrors of the slave trade, nor can it replace the cultures, languages, families that were destroyed. But it can serve as a form of testimony, offering a measure of truth and helping to ensure that the full scope of this history is never forgotten. We have to remember and listen. One of the most profound truths revealed by genetics is that Africa is home to the greatest human genetic diversity on the planet. Because modern humans originated in Africa and lived there for tens of thousands of years before migrating to other parts of the world, the continent became the repository for a vast library of human genetic variation. The small groups that left Africa carried only a subset of that diversity. This means that, in purely genetic terms, two people from different villages in Africa can be more genetically different from each other than a person from Europe is from a person from Asia. This fact is a testament to the continent's deep, complex history and human resilience. Adaptations to rainforest, desert, and high mountains. Surviving different diseases. Metabolizing different foods. Thriving in different climates. This diversity holds clues vital to understanding human health today. The reality of African genetic diversity undermines the simplistic and unscientific concept of race. There is no single gene for being black. Variation is vast and continuous. The genetic story is one of mixture, movement, and shared ancestry, not of pure, separate races. This truth is a powerful tool for combating racism. Studying ancient DNA shows lineages persisting for thousands of years alongside constant mixing, a complex tapestry of survival against the odds. Despite slavery, colonialism, and ongoing challenges, the genetic legacy of African peoples demonstrates profound resilience, a heritage for the entire world. As we unlock the secrets of ancient DNA, we must proceed with profound respect and a strong ethical compass. The bones, the teeth are the physical remains of human beings. People who lived, people who loved, people who died. In many cases, they are direct ancestors of communities living today. The first rule is respect for the dead and the living. Research cannot happen in a vacuum. Scientists must collaborate meaningfully from the very beginning. This means trust, clear language, listening to concerns. Consent must be informed and ongoing. Communities have the right to say no and to guide how their ancestors' stories are told. For too long, research in Africa was extractive. This colonial model must end. Ethical practice includes equal partnership with local scholars, open data, and investment in infrastructure, laboratories, training programs on the African continent. We must be vigilant about misuse of genetics to promote racism or division. Scientists have a responsibility to communicate carefully and combat misinterpretations. The goal is to unite by revealing our shared history, not to justify prejudice. With ethics, collaboration, and respect, ancient DNA can help heal old wounds and build a more just and truthful understanding of our human family. The power of ancient DNA extends far beyond the laboratory. For many, particularly in the African diaspora, this science offers a path toward reclaiming a lost or broken sense of identity. The slave trade severed family histories, languages, lands. While genetics can never fully restore what was lost, it can offer a thread of connection, a clue that points back to a region, a people, a history. The study of ancient DNA in Africa is still in its infancy. What we have learned so far is just a tantalizing glimpse. Many vast regions remain unstudied. Tools are becoming more powerful every year. New methods recover DNA from hotter, more humid climates. Places once thought to have lost all genetic material. Exploring ancient empires in West Africa. The deep past of the Congo Basin. Countless other stories waiting to be told. What comes next? Rise of early cities, early states. Genetic diversity of their inhabitants. How people adapted to new diseases and changing climates. Tracing ancient trade routes with greater precision. Revealing networks of connection we never dreamed of. Each new genome sequenced is like finding a new book in a lost library. It adds a new voice. It adds a new perspective. It adds new details to humanity's epic story. This work requires our support. Encourage funding agencies to invest in ethical projects. Invest in collaborative projects, projects led by and involving African scholars. We need journalists. We need educators. Share findings in ways that are clear, responsible, empowering. We, as individuals, must remain curious. Open to having old ideas challenged by new evidence. Truth is often more complex and more beautiful than the simple stories we were told. Embracing complexity is a sign of strength. Give credit where credit is due. Correct injustices of historical misrepresentation. The message from our ancient genes: profound hope and unity. We are one human family, shared origin on the African continent. Our histories are deeply intertwined. Ancient DNA gives us a clearer view of connections. Use this knowledge to heal the wounds of the past. Celebrate ingenuity and resilience of African peoples. Build a future where every person's history is recognized and respected. The story is not over. By listening to the ancestors, it is just beginning.